to The Public Interest. I am Malika Ramsey. Thanks for joining us again this week. With me is leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Brigadier the Honorable David Granger. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for that.
As you would know by now, the Guyana Public Service Union has been prevalent in the news over the past month or so. And of course, with good reason. The Public Service Union is not happy with the 5% increase promised to our public servants. But even before we talk about APNU's position on that, Mr. Granger, now, apart from this 5% increase, this is not the first time that the Guyana Public Service Union is having issues with the government of Guyana. I know this feud, if you want to call it that, has been ongoing. Now, the public service is a group, that should be not only important to the development of our country, but in terms of giving support to government as it relates to developing our country. Why is it that we see this continued rift between the Guyana Public Service Union and the government?
A very loaded question, and the answer is going to be difficult to put in a few words. But there is a long background. I think during the 1960s, as you may know, between 1957 and 1964, for 7 years, there was a PPP administration. And the relationships between the public services, it was then called the British Guyana Civil Service Association, the BGCSA, and the PPP administration. The relations were always very prickly, but don't let's go there now.
Okay.
When the PPP returned to office in 1992, unfortunately, the memories of the adversarial relations during the 1960s were rekindled, and the PPP always seemed unprepared to sit down at the bargaining table and negotiate with the Guyana Public Service Union, which of course is the union that took over from the British Guyana Civil Service Association. So the big problem has been, since 1992, the failure of the PPP administration to actually sit down and negotiate with the public servants. That is one. The second thing is that the public servants are really badly paid. And if you want an efficient government, an efficient administration, you need to pay the public servants better, and to do that you need to sit down and find out what the public servants are earning and what they need in order to live comfortably and work productively. So that is the second problem. The third problem is that the government enters into various conventions, international conventions, with the International Labour Organization, Human Rights Conventions, and so on. But these conventions call for the respect of collective bargaining, respect for workers' rights, respect for the rights to assemble. And the government has not been observing those conventions. In particular, it has not observed the requirement to embark on the collective bargaining process. If the two sides have a dispute, the government has a tendency of simply imposing some pay increase. Usually it is an increase without consultation with the public service. And I think these are some of the problems that irk the public service. And these are the problems that have led to literally 20 years of conflict between the PPPC and the GPSU.
Brigadier, do you get the sense, or I should ask, do you believe that if government can somehow have a more hands-on role in terms of control may not be a good word, but in terms of running the Guyana Public Service Union, do you believe that our public servants would actually get to a better state if government is to have a more hands-on role?
Well, the Public Service Union is an independent, non-governmental organization, and there's no way that the government can control that. It's an autonomous body. What the government needs to do is to observe and accept its role as the employer, and it has an obligation under the collective bargaining agreement to enter into discussions with its employees, and that those employees are represented by an organization called the GPSU. So there is two separate entities, And the government must sit down and negotiate with the GPSU. It's not doing that now. It can't control the GPSU, so it tried to destroy the GPSU. And I think that is the root of the problem, that it has tried to, particularly since the 1999 strike, it has tried to break the union's will. It has terminated the arrangement by which union fees were deducted at the pay table and paid over to the union. It has created a large category of contract employees. So rather than entering the public service, new public servants are sometimes put on contract and encouraged not to join the union. So there's a large body of non-unionized public servants for the first time, and many of those persons work on contracts. The contracts seem to be more attractive than the salaried employees, but they're also more vulnerable. The civil servants who draw those contracts, who enter into those contracts, are more vulnerable because at the end of the contract, maybe at the end of a year, it can simply be dismissed. Whereas most public servants have security of tenure. You can't dismiss a public servant without due process. So the government has been opting to create a large number of contract positions. So they are undermining the GPSU. That's what they're doing.
I'm happy that you did say undermining, because my next question basically is, do you believe that the prevalence of these contract workers could eventually kill the public service union, the union of itself? Could that happen?
It can weaken it, but I don't think there's any danger of killing it.
Okay.
It will be a long, slow process. But it is quite clear that many senior public servants are no longer in the union. And many of the union members tend to be middle and lower levels.
Okay. I'll eventually want to talk about the 5% increase separately, but before we talk about that, I know a Partnership for National Unity has been talking about some of the conditions, things that need to be improved again, public service, or public servants, sorry. What are some of those conditions that you feel need to be immediately looked at so that our public servants can be in a better state?
That's a very good question. Certainly, the biggest problem facing public servants is the cost of living. Mm-hmm. Many of them, I would not hesitate to say, are living on the edge. They have to borrow money sometimes to pay medical emergencies. They have to borrow money to pay sometimes utilities. As you know, from time to time, you may get a whopping electricity bill. And then, of course, they have to run their households. I would feel that the government needs to do a careful study to determine what is necessary for a public servant to maintain his family. Even if his wife is working, or in the case of a woman, even if her husband is working, children have to go to school, mortgages have to be repaid. And I understand the governments need to have an efficient public service, but there must be a balance between the two. The public service must be, capable and efficient. It doesn't have to be very large, but at the same time, they must be paid sufficiently too. So it's not enough for the government to demand work. It's also necessary for the public servants to demand better pay for their work too. I think the biggest problem is the cost of living, and the government is simply not in the mood of really understanding or appreciating what the public servants want. If you compare, comparisons are normally odious, but if you compare the speed with which disputes are resolved in the sugar industry, sometimes within 72 hours. There might be a wildcat strike, and next day they're in the bargain table, next day they're back at work. But with the public service, problems seem to go on for weeks, sometimes months. And in fact, in this case, since the tribunal of 1999, this is 14 years, we've had problems almost every year. So the big problems will come back to the cost of living, and what is the government going to do about that?
All right. I'm happy you ended on that note of the fact that it comes back to cost of living. This leads me to the 5% increase, of course, and I know a Partnership for National Unity is supporting the demands for more than 5% increase. Now, the opposition this year, you've been somewhat accused, or the blame game has begun. You're one of the groups being blamed for only 5% because you cut the budget. But my question really is, Mr. Granger, in your estimation, even before the existence of a Partnership for National Unity, public servants have been getting not what they deserve in terms of increase, the annual increase. What happened then and what happened now? It's more or less, I'm basically asking you to defend the Partnership for National Unity's role in this.
Well, there's nothing to defend because we are a principled partnership, and we took the position to support the Public Service Union in its demands. What we did not say is what the amount should be. But we did say that 5% was inadequate, and we did say that we would like to see the government and the union sitting down at the bargaining table working out what is a living wage for public servants. We have been criticized for not maybe being more in the forefront, but we have had good relations with the Public Service Union, and we still regard the problems they have with the government as being problems of that exist between employer and employee. We don't have a place in that process. That is a bargaining process which is subject to an agreement. Mm-hmm. So it would be quite imprudent for the partnership to insert itself in that process. We cannot say exactly what the public servants need, and we cannot say what the government can pay. So we said we will stand by and allow the two sides to negotiate. If necessary, we can be called in to provide assistance, but that stage hasn't been reached as yet. So I'm not worried about the criticism because we actually met with the executives of the Guyana Public Service Union, and we agreed on that position, that the public service knew what it was doing. It is one of the largest organizations in Guyana, and it did not want us to be involved at that point in time.
Ms. French, I know you can't read minds or you can't tell what other person's intention might be, but I must ask this. Often we only have this big, if you want to call it, big production about public servants at the end of the year when an increase is announced and it's not enough. Why do you believe that the union throughout the year, or throughout the years I should say, is somewhat quiet until something major happens? Is that good enough?
No, the union is quite active on the ground. As I said, from 1999, the PPP administration has tried to strangle the union by preventing the state agencies from deducting union fees, which used to be automatically deducted and paid over to the union. And it's also created this large core of contract workers who, for one reason or the other, are discouraged from becoming members of the Guyana Public Service Union. So that is part of the problem, that the union has been deliberately weakened, deliberately undermined by the government. In addition to that, the government just doesn't negotiate. The government simply imposes a percentage. So the members of the union themselves feel that their union is not being properly treated by the administration.
Can the union regain its strength without the involvement of government? Can that happen?
Well, the union has to do work among its constituents, and if you have 12,000 or more public servants, yes, I would say the union could do more spade work among public servants to get them to become voluntary members of the union, so that when a benefit or when salaries are increased, everybody would benefit. Because if you stay out of the union, I think this is probably a device by some persons. If they stay out of the union, they would get the benefit. And if they go into the union, they may have obligations. They may be called upon to picket and strike and so on, and they don't want to be visible. So they want to get the sweet without, taking the sour.
Okay.
But that is something that is known. But I think the union is responsible for its own membership, and I would leave it in the hands of the union.
All right. Words to note coming from a partnership for national unity are long-term and strategic plan to improve these conditions. Now, it may be taking you back to stuff that you would have already said. Maybe aside from the collective bargaining process between the union and government, how do we achieve these long-term improvements and to have a strategic plan?
The country needs an efficient public service if it is to be managed as a modern state. And I think that is the goal, that is the objective at which we should be aiming. We want to see Guyana well administered. We want to see proper law enforcement. We want to see proper regulation in the mining and environmental areas. We want to see in health, the nurses are efficient and more or less comfortable and satisfied. We want to see teachers in the schools who are highly motivated and are looking to get good results. If you demoralize the entire public service, if you demotivate them, you can see what will happen. The school system, the health system, the regulation of mining and environment, the whole administrative structure. There are about maybe 13 or 15,000 public servants in Guyana. It's a huge task force which runs this country. And without them, the country would grind to a halt. Taxes wouldn't be collected, the ports wouldn't function, nothing would happen. So, nothing will happen efficiently. So, we want to see that. So, what we are calling for in a partnership for national unity is for both sides to recognize that efficiency of the public service is the ultimate goal. And squabbling is not going to give us that modern state that Guyana should be. And that is why we are calling on the government to recognize its obligation to sit down with the public service union and find out what the workers want. I don't think the government has indicated that it has an interest in that. Now, for example, if you pay a public servant a certain amount of money, that public servant has to run a household, buy food, clothing for the children and all that. You have to look at it in a holistic way. So on the one hand, the government wants to get a certain level of performance. On the other hand, the public servant wants to get a certain level of remuneration. And we need to bring the two sides together so that there is some equilibrium between the employer and employee. It is not happening simply because the PPP is not talking to the union. It is simply staying at a distance and, throwing every year, destroying 3 or 4 or 5% of them without discussion. And people are dissatisfied with that. They're dissatisfied with the disrespect. And they're not even being called in to be told why they're getting 5% and not 4.5 or 5.5%. So there are lots of problems, and all of them arise out of the PPP's attitude.
How can the conventions of the International Labour Organization help to strengthen and restructure what's happening with our public servants?
Well, we are now in an era of globalization in which in many jurisdictions, particularly in the West, there is a sort of, I would say, equilibrium that when you go from one country to the next, you see certain standards, human rights standards, for example, health standards. So in the case of labor, these are now internationally recognized standards, that workers do have the right to form unions, that unions do have the right to demand that the employers sit down and speak with them. These are what the conventions protect: the rights of the workers to collective bargaining, the rights of the workers to join unions of their choice, and the rights of the workers to negotiate to improve their conditions. So it's not a one-way street, and the government can't get away with it because people pay attention to them. It's just like trafficking in persons. Every year, the government is criticized because of its lack of interest in bringing these abuses to an end. Human rights abuses, narcotics abuses. International organization is very powerful in that it calls on governments, it oversees governments, it demands that governments comply with international norms. So with regard to the ILO, the government has signed on to conventions. These are not things that drop from the sky. These are agreements and conventions which the government voluntarily entered into.
You did say that government voluntarily entered into these conventions, and apart from that, government, it is known, the importance of the public servants is known. Do you believe it is that government just lacks the political will to improve the situation?
I can't put myself in the mind of the government, but it is clear that they don't have the political will. But beyond that, they don't have the interest.
Why not?
Why not? Because as we started this conversation by pointing out that back in the 60s, there was a conflictual relationship between the government, the PPP government of the day, and the Civil Service Association. And it is evident from any commentary you read that the attitude of the PPP government today is conditioned, or it is being influenced by that historical rivalry. Well, it was worse than a rivalry, it's conflict. It's a confrontation. And it's just bad memories. It's just the PPP is living in the past and is unwilling to really sit down and say, well, look, we're faced with a new situation and we need to get the best of out of the public service. And the way to do that is by finding out what the needs are and trying to satisfy those needs. But it's not happening. You may call it a lack of political will, but others may call it a lack of interest, that they just don't care for the people who belong in the public service today.
Throughout the years we've seen, and it happens constantly, we've seen a breakdown and we've seen complaints coming from the Guyana Police Force, from people about the Guyana Police Force, the health ministry, the health sector. Are these problems result of what is happening in terms of the public service union, the public servants not getting their proper benefits?
It's a contributory factor. It's not absolute.
Okay.
It is possible that public servants need retraining. They need proper organization, proper tasking. I remember in the last days of President Hoyt's tenure in office, the public service was actually being reorganized. At one time, I think the number of ministries was reduced to about 10, and the service was being rationalized. But the PPP has increased the service now to about 20 ministries, and there's a lot of confusion, as we discussed in a previous conference. In the matter of roads alone, there are about 4 ministries involved in building roads. The Ministry of Housing builds its own roads, apparently, in the housing scheme. The Ministry of Environment builds its own roads in the hinterland. The Ministry of Local Government builds its own roads. The Ministry of Works builds its own roads. So the PPP is in a state of confusion in terms of its ability to administer the state. So what we see happening is that the public service itself is unaccustomed to this level of incompetence and to some extent corruption, and it needs to be reformed so that it can be more efficiently managed and it could more effectively perform its functions. So there needs to be work both in the public service and in the government level.
The answer to my next question might probably be obvious, but I have to ask this. If our public servants, that group, should somehow collapse or deteriorate further, what's the consequences for our nation?
Well, the public service as such is not in danger of collapse. What is happening now is the union is being prevented from effectively performing its function as a representative body for the workers. And because they are being hindered in their work, it is my view that that the efficiency of the public service has been impaired. You need happy public servants, people who are satisfied, and people who are treated as professionals. So I don't think they will collapse, but you'll see the quality of work that we have in the enforcement agencies, in the regulatory bodies, diminished. And when you see signs of corruption and graft, when you see public servants or even law enforcement officers seeking bribes or accepting bribes, these are indicators of, well, not only corruption, which is evident, but also of inefficiency, that people are not being correctly rewarded or supervised, and that's why they do these things. In a normal public servant, people should be adequately paid, and somebody attempts to bribe them, they report them to the police and say, get away, don't try to bribe me, I'm doing my work as a professional. But when people are paid badly, you know, they tend to do all sorts of strange things.
Okay. Brigadier, as we prepare to close this edition of the Public Interest, it was announced earlier that the Guyana Police Force has given permission for the Guyana Public Service Union to have these mass protests, if you want to call it that, regarding the fact that they're not satisfied with this 5% increase. I know initially in the beginning of this broadcast you did say that APNU supports the demands for more. How big of a role can you play in these protests, if you want to call it that?
Well, I would like to iterate the position of APNU. The controversy is really between the government of Guyana and the union. It would be inappropriate for us to intervene. We support the union because we feel that the union is sincere in its efforts to ensure that the public servants are well remunerated so they can perform better. And this is our line, that we want to pay the public servants more so they can do more in terms of their professional duties to the state. So we are going to continue working. We are going to continue giving our support to the union because we feel that that is the way to make Guyana a better place.
I know Partnership for National Unity believes in our National Assembly and taking matters to the National Assembly. I also know that we've already had the final sitting before the Christmas season, before the actual Christmas for this year, and the final sitting of the year. But do you intend to take the cause of our public servants to the National Assembly in 2014?
I do hope, and I think the entire partnership hopes, that over this Christmas period the government will come to its senses and call in the union, pay the public servants an increased salary, and also resolve some of the long outstanding issues. If it does not happen over the holiday period, there is every likelihood that we are going to raise the matter in the National Assembly with a view to supporting the union's demands and advancing the workers' struggle.